She kept a knife hidden in her skirt every single day. Not out of paranoia. Out of 3 years of living alone on land that wasn't legally hers, waiting for the knock that meant someone had come to collect. She hadn't had a visitor in 4 months. She had 2 locks on her door and an old rifle over the frame, and the kind of stillness inside her that comes when a person has been afraid for so long they've forgotten what it felt like before. Then a stranger knocked, and instead of fear, he brought something she hadn't felt in years, the smallest, most dangerous thing in the world: hope. Strength isn't the absence of fear. It's what a woman builds, quietly, with her own 2 hands, while fear is still sitting at her table. Welcome to a channel that lives where the mountains meet the human heart, where every story is about cowboys and grit, about mothers and daughters, about strangers who become family, and about the love that grows in the hardest soil, slow and stubborn and absolutely real. If Clara's story already has your respect, hit that like and leave a comment, and subscribe. We ride out with a new story every week. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
That knock came when the sun was sitting highest in the sky, not in the evening when a soul gets to feeling lonely and sounds get all soft, and not at dawn when a woman's still lost in her dreams, before the world has a chance to bite. No, it came at high noon, right in the full glare of day. That harsh Colorado summer was leaning on the valley like it had a score to settle. Clara May Whitlock heard it from the back of the shack where she was mending a torn grain sack. Just one solid rap, and then another. They were slow, deliberate knocks, the kind that ain't asking for a thing. She laid that sack down nice and easy. Her fingers had already found the handle of the knife in her apron pocket before she even decided to move. She had not seen a single visitor in 4 whole months. Not since old Hattie Greer rode up from the settlement to tell her all quiet-like, the way women pass on bad news. That Jeb Whitlock had been seen down in Pueblo, that he was alive, and that he was drinking heavy and talking too much. Clara had thanked Hattie, given her a jar of plum preserves, and watched her ride off till she was just a speck. Then she went back inside and threw a second bolt on the door. So when that knock echoed, slow and patient, like the man outside had all the time in the world, Clara May Whitlock knew better than to holler out, "Who's there?" She slipped over to the one front window, pressed herself flat against the wall, and took a peek. She froze, solid. The man on her porch was the biggest man she had ever laid eyes on. A good 6'6" easy. His shoulders took up the entire doorframe. The sun had burned his neck and arms to a deep copper color. His boots were thick with the dust of a long journey, like he'd walked straight across the whole territory. A rifle was slung across his back. He was holding a beat-up, sweat-stained brown hat in his 2 big hands. He did not knock a third time. He just stood there, waiting. Clara watched him for a full minute. He did not shuffle his feet or get restless. He did not look around, sizing up the place. He never once said her name. He just stood there, holding that hat like a fella who came to pay a debt and was not sure he would be let in. She moved the knife from her apron and tucked it into the waistband of her skirt, hidden from sight. Then she slid the bolts back. The door hinges let out a long groan, same as they always did. Everything in that shack groaned. It had all been groaning for 2 long years, ever since Jeb took off with the money and left the place to fall apart. The door creaked open. The man on the other side looked even bigger up close. He did not move a muscle. He did not take a step forward or lean in. He kept his boots planted firm. He just looked at her. His eyes were a steady brown, set in a face lined by the sun. He had a jaw that looked like it had seen its share of trouble, and when he spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her. "Ma'am, I will not cross this threshold unless you say it is okay." Clara blinked. In all her 34 years, no man had ever said something like that to her. Not her father, not the boys at the feed store where she used to work. and certainly not Jeb, who had crashed through every door in her life without even a hint of permission. Those words found a place to land deep down inside her. She let out a sound she did not expect, a short little laugh that did not sound like her own. "Well now, you are nearly bigger than this whole cabin." It was the honest truth. He just about was. The man did not smile. Instead, he did something she would have never guessed. He bent his knees, real slow and careful, and lowered himself down right there in the dirt, onto both knees. With his hat still in his hands, 6'6" of a mountain of a man just folded himself up on her doorstep. He took a position she had not asked for and could not figure out. Clara's hand went straight for the knife at her waist. "You stay right there," she said, her voice sharp as a new nail. "I am not reaching for anything," he said, his voice calm. "I have just—" He paused for a second, choosing his words. "I have not been welcomed anywhere in 3 years, ma'am. I just figured I would make myself smaller for a minute." The silence between them felt heavy. Off on the ridge, a meadowlark began to sing its song. Clara Whitlock stood in that crooked doorway with a knife hidden in her skirt, looking down at a giant of a man on his knees, who had just said the most truthful thing she had heard in a long, long time. And she felt something inside her chest give way that she could not put a name to and did not trust. She asked him very carefully, "What is it you need?" "Work," he answered. "I can fix what is broken. Just from standing here, I can see your porch beam is sagging. Your chimney is not drawing right, and the smoke is blowing back. Your upper window frame is black with soot, and that well pulley is screaming like it is about to die. I will fix all of it for a roof over my head and some meals. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then I will be on my way. And if I tell you no, then I will get up and leave. Simple as that." Just like that. She took a good long look at him. She saw the old rope burns on his left wrist where his sleeve was pushed back. She watched the way he held his hat, not antsy, not faking his calm. He was truly calm. She noticed the rifle on his back and the fact he had not made a single move toward it. "What is your name?" she asked. "Elias," he said. "Elias Boone Mercer." "Where are you coming from, Elias Boone Mercer?" "South," he said. "Before that, west. It does not really matter." "It matters to me." He met her eyes. "Trinidad. Before that, Taos. Before that, I was on a cattle drive from Texas. It went bad for a man who had it coming to him." Clara did not ask which man. The way he said it told her it was a long story, and he had already decided how much of it he would share. "Are you wanted by the law?" she asked him, straight out. "Not anymore," he said. "There was a warrant back in '73. A judge tossed it out 2 years ago. I have the paper if you want to see it." "So why are you still acting like someone is on your trail if the law is not after you?" A quiet moment passed. Something moved in his eyes. "Old habits," he said. "Besides, some men do not need a warrant to come after a fella." Clara sized him up for another second. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come on in," she said. "I will put some coffee on. You can sit at the table. But if you touch a single thing in this cabin you are not told to, I will put this knife through your hand so fast you will not even have time to yell. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. He got up from the ground real slow, like he was giving her plenty of time to change her mind, and came inside. He had to duck his head a good 4 inches just to get through the doorway. Clara walked to the stove, keeping her back as straight as a board and her hands steady, though they wanted to shake. She slid the knife under the table right where her left hand could get to it quick. The coffee cup looked like a doll's toy in his big hands. That was the first thing she noticed when he sat down. How his palm just swallowed it up. How the old wooden chair complained a little under his weight. He did not seem to pay any mind to either thing. He held the cup gently, like a man who knows he could crush it without thinking. He was comfortable in the quiet. That was the next thing she noticed. Most men she had known could not stand the silence. Jeb hated it. He would fill it with noise, like he was scared of what she might say if he ever stopped talking. He used words like a drunk uses a bottle, always needing more. This Elias Mercer just sipped his coffee and looked around the room. He was quiet for a full 3 minutes. Clara realized she was the one who spoke first. "You mentioned Trinidad," she said. "That is where Jeb Whitlock has been spending his time." His whole body tensed up. It was a tiny thing, almost not there. But she had learned to read men just to stay alive, and she saw it clear as day. "I know the name," he said. "Do you know the man?" "I know of him." There was a pause. "I know he left a wife up in the high valley north of Segundo. I know he owed money to 3 different men when he disappeared. I know the story was different depending on who was telling it." "And which story made its way to you?" she asked, her voice steady. He looked her right in the eye. "The one I heard was that you were the one who ran him off, that you had finally had enough of his ways." Clara put her cup down. "That is the polite way to say it. I figured as much." "He did not leave," she said, and her voice was hard and clear without a single tremor in it. "He ran. He ran away owing $300 to the Halverson brothers, and he left the deed to this property all tangled up in that debt. It left me stuck. I cannot sell, I cannot borrow against it, I cannot do a single thing but stay right here and wait for his trouble to come knocking at my door." Elias did not say a word. "No one ever came," she went on. "Halverson died in the winter of '74. His sons do not even know I exist. But for 3 years I have been waiting for a knock on that door that would mean the whole mess was finally over. So, when I knocked on your door," he said, his words slow and measured, "you figured I was one of them." "I thought maybe my long wait was finally over," she replied. "Yes." He gave a single small nod and set his cup down with that same careful way he did everything. Then he spoke again. "I am not here to collect on anything, Miss Whitlock. I'm just a man looking for 2 weeks of honest work and a roof that is not the wide-open sky, which seems determined to do me in most nights." "It is Mrs. Ma'am?" "It is Mrs. Whitlock. According to the law, I am still his wife. Jeb never did get around to the paperwork." A different look crossed his face. It was not pity. She would have despised that. It was something else entirely. It was a look of knowing. The look of a man who knew exactly what it felt like to be trapped by a weight that had no right holding him down. "I will be gone from your property before the sun comes up and after it goes down. You will hardly know I am here except for seeing things get fixed." She held his gaze for a long, steady moment. "There is a lean-to behind the barn," she told him. "It will keep the rain off you. You will sleep there." "Yes, ma'am." "You will have your meals out here on the porch, not inside my home." "Yes, ma'am." "And if you ever, and I mean this, ever raise your voice on this land for any reason, I will not waste my breath asking you to leave. I will just make it so you can no longer stay." He met her eyes, and she could see he understood the full weight of her words. "I hear you loud and clear," he said, "and it will not be a problem." He started working on that broken porch beam that very afternoon. Clara watched him from the kitchen window, the same way she would watch a storm build up over the eastern mountains, trying to understand something she did not yet trust. He worked without making a big fuss. That took her by surprise. The men she had known always had to make a grand show out of their work, grunting and cussing, making sure everybody knew how hard they were toiling. Elias Mercer just worked. He studied the beam, tested it with his own body weight, and then pulled his tools from a worn saddlebag. His movements were fluid and sure. He did not rush, but he did not waste a single motion either. By the time the sun slipped down behind the western ridge, that porch beam was as solid as bedrock. He did not come knocking to tell her it was finished. He did not ask her to come and inspect it. She just heard the soft creak of the lean-to door as he put his tools up for the night. Later, when she came out onto the porch to get the water bucket, she stepped right on that board without a second thought, and it held solid beneath her. She just stood there for a moment. Just stood there, feeling it hold. The next 3 days passed in much the same way. He mended the chimney draft on the second morning. She knew because the dark smoke had finally stopped backing up into the house. He fixed the squeaky pulley on the well the third day without her saying a word. On the evening of that third day, she brought a plate of food out to the porch herself instead of just leaving it on the railing. She took a seat in the chair at the other end. He sat on the top step. He ate his meal slow and easy. She watched the mountains fade into shadows in the distance. "You mentioned a cattle drive that went bad," she said. "Down in Texas." He did not so much as blink. "I did." "What kind of trouble was it?" He was quiet for a good long while. Not like he was hiding anything, just turning it over in his mind. She could tell the difference. "There was a girl," he finally said. "Lakota, about 14 years old. She wandered into our camp looking for her father's horse that had strayed off. The sheriff's son was riding with us. He got the notion that she did not need to be taken back to her people." A heavy quiet settled between them. "I put an end to it." Elias said things got out of hand. "I broke the boy's arm in 2 places. He ran and told his father I attacked him for no reason. The sheriff believed his son. And the girl made it back home safe. Her father got a message to me through a trapper I knew. Said to tell me she was okay. So you took the blame for defending her. I stopped a boy from doing something that could never be undone. That is all I did. And the warrant for your arrest. Assault and battery. I lit out of there before they could put me in a cage. Been moving for 3 years." He paused for a moment. "The warrant is gone now, just like I told you. A judge reviewed the whole mess and threw it out. But that sheriff's son, he is 23 now." He glanced toward the dark mountain range. "Some men just get used to not having a place to belong. After a while, it feels a whole lot easier than trying to fit back in." She understood that feeling in a way that took her by surprise. The kind of knowing you get not because someone explains it, but because you have lived the same kind of loneliness, just in a different life. She did not say any of this to him, not then. She just picked up his empty plate and went back into the house. On the 5th day, he found the letters. He was not looking for them. He was reaching for something behind a grain shelf in the storage room. She had asked him to check a weak spot in the floor joists, and his hand brushed against a bundle of folded papers tied with old brown twine. He set them carefully on the shelf and did not even glance at them. He put them right back where he found them as soon as the joist was secure. But at supper, Clara saw his eyes drift to that back wall for just a second, and she said, "You found them." "I had to move them to reach the joist. I put them right back, exactly where they were. I did not read them." She was quiet for a spell. Then she said, "My daughter, Hannah. She is 21 now. She left 2 years before Jeb did. Went east to her aunt's in Missouri. Got about as far from this valley as a person can get. I cannot say that I blame her. Do you write to her?" "I write." A silence stretched between them. "I just do not ever send the letters." He was quiet for a moment. "How come?" "Because every single one of them begins the same way. It starts with 'I am sorry.' And I have been sorry for so long, I do not think that word has any power left in it." Elias looked down at his own calloused hands. "A word only means as much as the action that comes after it. And what action is supposed to come after it, in your professional opinion?" The sharpness in her voice was not for him. He could hear that as plain as day. "The thing you do differently," he said, "just as simple as that." She looked him right in the eye. He was not giving a sermon. He was not trying to teach her a lesson about being saved. He said it the same way a man might say, "The chimney is drawing properly now. This was the problem. This is what fixed it. This is the next thing to do." She did not say anything. He did not say anything. The night fell deep and quiet over the valley. It was on the 8th day when the rider appeared on the southern ridge. Elias saw him first. He was on the roof checking shingles when a figure showed up against the afternoon sky. It was a man on a dark horse, just sitting there, watching the property down below. Not moving, not getting any closer, just watching. Elias slid down the side of the cabin and walked to the corner, trying not to let on that he had seen anything. Clara was at the water barrel by the side of the house. "Do not look toward the south," he said in a low voice as he walked past her. "There is a rider on the ridge, been sitting there for 5 minutes." She went completely still. Her hand tightened on the bucket handle. "Describe him," she said, her voice as steady as a stone. "Dark horse, lean man, average height, wearing a gray jacket, sitting there way too still." She closed her eyes for a single heartbeat. "Cole Ransom," she said. "Who is that?" "He used to ride with Jeb. He's the kind of man who only appears if someone sent him to find something. Or if he is looking for something for himself." Her jaw set like granite. "It all comes to the same thing in the end." Elias said, "Do you want me to go up there and have a talk with him?" "I want you to get right back up on that roof," she said. "And I want you to make absolutely sure he sees you up there." He understood immediately. "He needs to see you are not out here all by your lonesome. I want that man to ride back and tell his boss there is a mountain of a man on my roof with a clear shot all the way to the south ridge." "That is a smart play," Elias said. "A woman alone has to be." He pulled himself back onto the roof. The rider on the ridge just sat his horse for another 10 minutes. Then he wheeled the animal around and dropped out of sight, never getting any closer. That evening, Elias sat on the porch's top step, his dinner plate mostly untouched. Clara came out carrying 2 cups of coffee this time, not just one. She settled into her chair and said, "He is going to tell Jeb. I expect Jeb will be coming." Elias turned his head to look at her. "When he gets here, do you want me to be gone or do you want me to stay?" The question hung heavy in the quiet air between them. Clara cradled the warm cup in both her hands. She thought of the carving knife she had stashed under the table. She thought of the $300 and the tangle of paperwork for the deed. She thought of Cole Ransom perched on that ridge like a hawk taking stock of his territory. Then she thought about the porch beam that no longer complained when she walked on it. "I am through making choices out of fear," she said. "I lived that way for 7 years, and I am done with it." "That is not really an answer," he said quietly. "I know it is not," she replied. She took a sip of her coffee. "This is my land," she finally declared. "You are a man I hired to work on it. If Jeb Whitlock has a problem with the man I pay to fix my roof, he can come here and say so to me directly." Elias gave a slow, single nod. "All right, then," he said. He returned his gaze to the darkening valley. She went back into the cabin. She retrieved the knife from its hiding spot and slipped it into the waistband of her skirt where it stayed. On the morning of her 10th day with the hired man, she went to a shelf in the back room. She untied the old brown twine around a stack of letters. She took the one from the top, the newest one from April, and read it straight through just once. When she finished, she folded it carefully back along its original creases. For a long time, she just sat there, holding it in her hands. She remembered what Elias had told her. A promise is only as good as the work that follows it. She thought about all the work that had followed. The porch was solid as a rock. The chimney drew smoke straight and true, and the pulley on the well now sang a smooth, steady tune. She thought about sleeping soundly through the night, not jolting awake at every little noise for the first time in 3 long years. She moved to her small writing desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper. She started to write a new letter. She did not begin with the words, "I am sorry." She began with, "Hannah." The roof held up against the last big storm. "I wanted you to know that first." She stopped for a moment, just holding the pen. From outside, she could hear the steady rhythm of a hammer on shingles. Elias was finishing the backside of the roof, the very part she had tried to patch with tar cloth for 2 whole years. She wrote, "I need to tell you about the summer your house finally stopped falling apart." She kept writing, the words flowing, until the afternoon sun started to dip low. She did not seal the letter, but she folded it. But this time she left it right there on the table instead of tucking it away behind the shelf of grain. That evening, Elias came up to the porch, and his eyes landed on the folded letter sitting on the railing. He glanced at it, then through the open door at Clara, who had her back to him as she stirred a pot on the stove. He said nothing about the letter. He just sat down on the top step and picked up his coffee. He looked out over the valley, watching the long purple shadows of twilight creep across the tall grass. After a while, Clara appeared in the doorway. "It is not sealed," she said. "I have not decided for sure." "Okay," he answered. It needed to exist somewhere other than hidden away behind the grain." "All right," he said again. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. "You reckon I should send it?" He chose his words carefully. "I think a letter left out on a table means the decision is already made. You just have not said it out loud to yourself yet." She watched him for a good long moment, then turned and went back inside the cabin. She walked over and picked up that letter. She folded it closed. She set it by the door, ready for the trip to the settlement post as soon as a clear morning came. Then she sat down at the table. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara May Whitlock put her head in her hands, not from sadness or from being scared, but from a feeling that was awfully close to the start of relief, and she let the silence settle around her. Outside, the valley went dark. The roof was quiet. By morning, the letter was gone. Not taken. Sent. Clara had carried it down to the settlement road herself, well before Elias had even stirred. She handed it to the Greer boy who ran the mail on Tuesdays, and she walked back up the path in the pale morning glow. Her hands felt strangely light, and her chest felt like she had finally put down a heavy boulder she had been carrying for so long she forgot she was even holding it. She never mentioned sending it to Elias, and he never brought it up. But when she walked back into that cabin and smelled fresh coffee on the stove and saw a new log glowing in the hearth, she knew he understood. That is how quiet men know things sometimes, without a single word passing between them. They know because they are paying attention, while everyone else is making a racket. She poured herself a cup and sat, saying nothing of Hannah or the letter or how her hands had shaken just a bit on the walk home. She just drank her coffee and let the morning happen. It was the 11th day, and something had changed inside that cabin, something neither of them had a name for yet. Elias finished the roof that afternoon. The entire thing. The back slope, the north side, the ridge cap she had wasted 2 summers trying to fix with tar cloth. He finished it with no celebration, just like everything else he did. He climbed down the ladder with sawdust in his hair, and an expression that was the nearest thing to satisfied she had ever seen on him. She was waiting there on the porch. "It will hold," he said. "Should get you through the fall, probably winter too, if you bank that north wall before a real freeze hits." "I know how to bank a wall," she told him. "I know you do." A quiet beat passed between them. "Thank you," she said. The words felt cleaner than she expected. There were no hidden meanings, no walls behind them. Just 2 plain and simple words. He gave her a single nod and went to put his tools away. She stayed on the porch a moment more, listening to the sound of nothing. Nothing dripped, nothing creaked, and nothing felt like it was about to collapse. She felt a feeling so foreign, it took her a full minute to recognize it. Safe. In that one little spot in the world, she felt safe. She did not trust the feeling, not one bit, but it was there all the same. That was the exact moment Cole Ransom chose to ride back into her valley. She heard the horse first. It was the sound of a rider taking his time, but not bothering to be quiet about it, coming up the main path like he had the deed in his pocket. She walked to the edge of the porch, but not off it, and watched Cole come around the bend on his dark horse, a gray jacket on his back. He had that same flat, dead-eyed look she remembered from the one other time Jeb had brought him to the cabin, 3 years back. They had played cards until 2 in the morning, a night that ended with the sound of breaking plates. Cole Ransom was not a big man. He was the kind of man who made up for his lack of size in other, more dangerous ways. He pulled his horse to a halt about 20 feet from the porch and stared right at her. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. His voice was friendly as could be, but his eyes were a different story altogether. "Clara," he said. "Heard you had a man doing some work up here." "I have a fella fixing the roof," she answered, her voice steady. "Well, it looks fixed now." He cast a glance up at the new shingles. "I bet that set you back a pretty penny." "I am getting by just fine," she told him. "Jeb's been worried about you," Cole said. "He sent me on up to check on things. Make sure you are not having any difficulties." That word, difficulties, hung in the air like a threat. He meant for it, too. "You tell Jeb," Clara said, her voice not shaking one bit, "that I do not need his concern. You tell him this property is in good hands, and I aim to keep it that way. He might just want to ride up and see for himself. He is more than welcome to file the proper paperwork with a judge and make his claim on this place legal and above board," she shot back. "Until that day, this is my land, and I am the one who says who steps foot on it." Cole just stared at her for a long, hard second. You could almost see the gears turning in his head. "That fella from the mountain still around?" he asked. And right on cue, walking at a calm, deliberate pace, Elias Mercer came around the side of the barn. He had a splitting axe in one hand and his hat in the other. He did not utter a single word. He just stood there. Cole sized him up the way a smaller man does a bigger one, doing the quick math on his height, the width of his shoulders, the old rope burns around his wrists, and the easy way Elias held that axe. It was not a threat, but he was not putting it down either. "Mercer," Cole said, and the air got thick. Elias answered, "Ransom." They knew each other. Clara's head whipped around to look at Elias. He never took his eyes off Cole. His gaze was locked on Cole, flat and steady, not giving an inch. "It is a small world," Cole said with a sneer. "Not small enough, looks like," Elias replied. Cole forced a smile that his eyes wanted no part of. "You working for an honest dollar these days?" "I always have," Elias said. "That is not the story Jeb tells." "Jeb tells a lot of stories that do not exactly square with the truth," Elias said, "and I figure you know that as well as I do." Something shifted in Cole's expression. It was not fear exactly, but it was a close cousin. "Jeb's going to want to hear about this." "You go on and tell him whatever you think he needs to hear," Elias said. "And while you're at it, tell him the woman on this land has a legal claim, no debt on record against this deed, and a clear title that goes all the way back to the Colorado Territory Land Grant of 1871. Tell him if he wants to fight that, he can do it in front of a circuit judge for all the world to see." Cole went perfectly still. "You looked up the deed," he said, his voice flat. "I surely did," Elias confirmed. "Turns out, the Halverson debt died when old man Halverson did. His sons never filed to inherit the claim. It expired clean as a whistle 2 years ago. This property is hers, free and clear, and has been since the winter of 1874. Clara felt something inside her chest just let go, a knot she had been holding on to for 3 long years without even realizing it was there. Free and clear, for 2 years. She had been free for 2 entire years and never even knew it. She turned and looked at Elias. He still was not looking at her. His eyes were on Cole, solid as a brick wall. Cole's gaze bounced between the two of them, redoing all his previous calculations. "Jeb is still her husband," he said at last, but it sounded weak. "The law says—" "The law says a whole lot of things," Clara broke in. Her voice was as clear as a bell. And I am planning on using every last one of them. You can tell Jeb that, too. Cole just sat on his horse for about 10 more seconds. Then, without saying another word, he turned that horse around and rode back down the path he came on. Elias watched him until he was completely out of sight. Only then did he finally turn and look at Clara. She was looking right at him. "You looked it up," she said. "It is yours," he replied. He told her he had ridden to the settlement records office a week ago, the morning after he saw Ransom watching the property from up on the ridge. "You did not tell me." "I wanted to be absolutely certain before I told you something that meant so much." She held his gaze. "You knew Ransom." "Our paths have crossed before." "That is not what I asked." A moment passed between them. "We both left the same part of Colorado in the same year, just for different reasons. I know the kind of man he is, and he knows the kind of man I am not." "What does that mean?" "It means he works for men like Jeb," Elias said. "He watches things for them, scouts for them, and reports back. He will not start a fight himself, unless he knows he can finish it with plenty of witnesses on his side. He is very careful like that." "Is he dangerous?" "He is the kind of dangerous that does not look it," Elias said. "And that is the worst kind of all." Clara let out a long, slow breath. "Free and clear," she said. "Free and clear." 2 years. Why did the records office not? Nobody ever filed the papers to let you know. Nobody had a reason to. You would have had to go look for it yourself, and you had no idea there was anything to look for. She sat down on the porch step, not because she was feeling weak, but because the news was just so big. She needed to set it down for a minute while she figured out how to carry it. Elias sat on the step just below her, giving her the higher spot and giving her space. They sat like that for a good long while. "He is still my husband," she said. "Legally. And right now, legal is the only thing that matters." "There are lawyers down in Pueblo who handle divorces," he said. "Him abandoning you is cause enough. 3 years is more than enough time." "I know that," she said. "I have known that for some time." After another quiet moment, she said, "I just did not know if knowing was enough to actually do something." "It is a start," he said. She looked down the empty track where Cole Ransom had disappeared around the bend. "He is going to tell Jeb everything," she said. "Yes. Jeb is going to come. Probably. And when he does," Elias said, "you will be a woman with a clear title to her own land, legal grounds for a divorce, and a witness to him trespassing if he sets 1 foot over that property line." He paused. "And I will still be here, fixing what needs fixing." She gave him a sideways glance. "You said 2 weeks, maybe 3? "I found a problem with the foundation on the east corner," he said, his voice completely straight. "That is going to take a bit longer." She looked him right in the eye. He just stared out at the empty track. The corner of his mouth twitched just a little bit. She turned away before she said something that might make the next few minutes awkward. "Supper is at 6, she said, and then she went inside. The door did not close with a hard thud. That was different. It was the first time since he had arrived that she had gone through a doorway without keeping a firm grip on it behind her. He noticed. He did not make a big thing out of it, but he noticed. Inside, standing all by herself in her kitchen, Clara May Whitlock gripped the edge of her work table with both hands. She whispered it to the quiet room. "Free and clear." Then she stood up straight, let go of the table, and started on supper like a woman who had a job to do. Because she did. She always had. The only difference was that now she was finally doing it on land that belonged to her and nobody else. The thought burned inside her like good whiskey, clean and strong. She did not cry. She was done crying about things that should have made her mad in the first place. She was mad now, and it felt a whole lot better. 2 days went by, and the feeling was like a wire pulled so tight it hummed. Elias kept working on that east foundation. Clara kept her eyes on the south ridge every morning, trying not to be obvious about it. No riders, no dust rising up from the track. Nothing. And somehow that was worse than seeing something. It was the kind of quiet that meant a decision was being made somewhere far away from her. Come evening on the second day, Elias walked onto the porch with his hands still caked in dirt from the foundation, and he said it straight out. "I have something to tell you. I should have said it sooner." Clara set aside her sewing. "I know Jeb Whitlock," he told her, "and not just by name. I crossed paths with him about 2 years back in a saloon down in Trinidad. I had no idea he was your husband then. I did not even know your name. I just knew he was the sort of man I did not care to sit next to for a minute longer than I had to." She stayed as still as a statue. "What went on in that saloon?" "He was talking to some fellas about land," Elias explained. "Talking about a piece of property up in the valley north of Segundo. He was saying the woman on it had no claim that would ever stand up in court. That her debts made the place ready for the taking for any man who acted quick enough. He was drinking and talking way too much, so I left before he finished making his pitch. He was trying to sell my land," she said, her voice as flat as a tabletop, "while he was still my husband. That is sure what it sounded like. And those men he was talking to? I do not know if they ever did a thing with what he told them. I do not know if they ever looked into it. I moved on the next day and never gave it another thought, not until I came up this ridge and saw this place and something." He trailed off. "Something what?" she pressed. "Something clicked," he said. "The valley north of Segundo, the woman living all alone, the problems with the deed. I was already headed this way, looking for work and a bit of clean high country air, tired of the lowlands. But when I came around that bend and laid eyes on this place, I knew." "You knew whose land this was?" "I had a pretty strong notion, and you came to my door anyway." "I came to the door," he said, "because if I was right about who was living here, then I figured I had some information she could surely use, and because I had been carrying that saloon talk around for 2 years without doing a thing about it, and it just was not sitting right with me." Clara sized him up for a long, hard moment. "You could have told me all that on the very first day," she said. "I suppose I could have," he agreed. "But I did not know you then. I had no idea how you would take such news or what you might do with it, or if I even had enough solid facts to be helpful instead of just plain scary. I needed to see that deed for myself first. So you made the decision about what I was ready to hear and when I was ready for it. I decided what was a proven fact and what was not." He said, "I was not trying to shield you from the truth. I was shielding you from a rumor that was all dressed up like a fact. There is a big difference." She knew deep down that he was right. Did not mean it did not sting some, though. "You should have told me," she said, "even if it was not proven. You should have let me be the one to decide what to do." "You are right," he said. "No excuses, no defense, just plain, you are right." She took up her sewing again. Her hands were steadier than she expected. "Is there anything else? Anything else you know or suspect or are waiting to prove before you think I ought to know?" "No," he said. "That is the whole of it." "You are certain?" "I am certain." She peered at him over her sewing. "If that changes, you tell me the minute it does. Proven or not, rumor or fact. You let me be the one to decide." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And this time those words felt different than they had on that first day. It was not the simple automatic politeness of a man raised to be courteous. It was something more thoughtful, more personal. She noticed the difference. She did not mention it. "The foundation," she said instead. "How many more days will it take?" He seemed to see they were switching subjects. "2, maybe 3 if I can find what I'm looking for on that south corner." "Go get some supper," she told him. He went and got his supper, and this time she carried a second chair out to the porch without him even needing to ask. It was on the 14th day that everything started happening fast. Clara had ridden down to the settlement to get flour and salt and a new buckle for a harness that had been busted since March. It was a normal trip. An hour down the trail, 20 minutes of business, an hour back. She had made that ride by herself 100 times. She sure did not expect to get home and find a strange man sitting on her porch who was not Elias. He was a young fella, in his early 20s and skinny, with a good horse tied to the rail. He had a face that looked like it could be friendly, just not right now, and his hat was shoved back on his head in a way that made him look even younger. He got to his feet when he heard her horse on the path and put both his hands out to his sides, far from his belt, real deliberate-like. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "I'm not here to bring you any trouble. My name is Tom Aldis. I rode with Jeb Whitlock this past spring. I quit his outfit 6 weeks ago, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with what I know ever since." Clara reined in her horse about 8 feet from the porch. "Where is Elias?" she asked. "Out back," Tom said. "He knows I am here. He was here when I arrived. He said I could wait." As if he had been summoned, Elias rounded the corner of the cabin. He looked at Clara and gave her a slight nod, like he was saying, "I have got him sized up. He is not a danger right now. It is your play." She swung down from her horse, tied the reins, and stood at the bottom of the porch steps looking right up at Tom Aldis. "Talk," she said. Tom Aldis talked. He talked for 20 minutes straight, and every single sentence that came out of his mouth was worse than the one before it. Jeb Whitlock had not been happy with Cole Ransom's report. Cole had told him about Elias and the whole situation with the deed. He told him Elias had looked into it, that the old Halverson claim was long expired, and that Clara had good grounds for a divorce. Jeb had listened to it all, and then, Tom said, he had put his drink down right in the middle of a sentence and got real still, the way he does when his mind is made up. He said he was not going to fight it in a court, Tom said. He said courts were for men who did not know how to handle their own business. "He is coming here," Clara stated. "He has been planning it for 2 weeks," Tom said, "ever since he got Cole's first report. He has got 2 other fellas with him besides Cole. Hard men, Mrs. Whitlock. Not like me. Not like the cowboys who just ride for their pay. He is planning to come in fast and make sure there are no—" He stopped himself. "No witnesses," Elias said, standing right behind her. Tom looked over at him. He said, "Burn the cabin." He said, "Make it look like a summer wildfire." The quiet that came after that was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard in all her years. She stood there at the bottom of her own porch steps, her porch, on her land, with her own free and clear deed, and she felt the hot anger in her chest cool right down to something hard and useful, like steel. When Elias said, "I do not know the exact day," Tom said, "but he was talking about making his move before the month was out. He wanted to wait until after the settlement's monthly get-together, so most folks would be away from the valley. That is next Saturday, 6 days from now." "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. Tom looked her square in the eye. Something in his young face shifted. It was guilt. She recognized that particular shade of it on a man who had gotten tangled up in something he was not proud of, and was now trying to find his way back. "Because I have got a mother," he said, "and because I am not that kind of man. I did not realize what kind of outfit I had signed on with until I was already 2 months in. And by that point, leaving without saying my piece felt just as wrong as staying quiet." Clara looked him square in the eye for a good long while. "Are you willing to say all that to a judge?" she finally asked. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. "That's exactly why I'm here. I wanted to tell you first before I rode on to Pueblo to find one." "Well, then you'd best get to finding one," she said, "and you'd best ride like the wind is at your back." Tom Aldis gave a nod, pushed himself to his feet, grabbed his hat, and was up on that horse in less than a minute. She watched him take the south track, moving at a right good clip. Then she turned around. Elias was there, just watching her. "6 days," she said, her voice low. "Could be less," he answered. The second Jeb hears about a young rider heading for this property, Ransom will tell him about Aldous. He'll push everything up. So how much time do we really have? Elias thought on it for a moment. The honest-to-God answer? I don't rightly know. Might be 6 days, might be tomorrow. Clara walked up the porch steps, pushed through her cabin door, and stopped right in the middle of her kitchen. She took a good long look all around it, at the clean chimney, the solid floorboards, and the wall where that ugly black smoke stain used to be. She saw the little table where letters were once tucked behind the grain shelf, and the chair where a very big man used to drink his coffee with such careful hands, saying true things without any fancy words. She turned back around. Elias was standing right there in the doorway. I need you to listen to me, she said. I'm listening, he replied. This here is my property, and I'm going to keep it. Whatever comes to pass between this moment and whenever Jeb decides to show his ugly face, I'm keeping this place. And I'm going to do it right out in the open, not by sneaking around and not by my lonesome. All right, he said. I need you to ride into the settlement first thing tomorrow and tell Hattie Greer everything Tom Aldous told us. Hattie's husband is on the Valley Council. I need folks to understand what was already settled before a single thing went sideways. It was a done deal. He said, I'll need another signature on that deed. She told him, someone besides me and some clerk at the records office, someone who can stand up and speak the legal facts plain. I'll take it into town myself and get it notarized. He replied, I can take care of that when I see Hattie. She paused, and he just waited. I have to know, she said, her voice dropping a little. I have to know if it comes down to it. And it might not. Lord, I surely hope it does not. But if it comes to one of those moments where a choice has got to be made in the blink of an eye, I have to know whose side you're on. Clara, he said. And that was the first time he'd ever used her given name. She stood there, still as a stone. I was fixing to be gone in 2 weeks, he said. I told you that, and I meant every last word of it. I wasn't about to bring my kind of trouble to your doorstep. He took a breath. But I looked up that deed because I couldn't just ride on without making certain you had what you needed to keep what was yours. And I told you about that saloon because carrying that weight all by myself was something I just couldn't do anymore. He paused again, this one quieter than the last. I'm not going anywhere. That could cost you, she said softly. Everything I've ever done that amounted to a hill of beans has cost me something, he answered. I've gotten pretty used to it. She just stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked away, out the window toward the ridge where the summer dark was starting its slow crawl over the tall grass. There's a rifle hanging over the door, she said. Jeb never knew a thing about it. He figured the one under our bed was the only gun in this whole house. He was wrong about that, just like he was wrong about a whole lot of other things. Good, Elias said. I've been shooting since I was 9 years old, she told him. My daddy made sure of that. Good, he said again. I'm not asking you to fight my battle for me, she said. I know you're not, he answered. I'm asking you to stand beside me while I fight it. Something flickered in his face right then. A look she'd never seen on him before. It wasn't quite relief, and it wasn't exactly gratitude, but a mix of the two with something older and a whole lot more tired underneath. It was the look of a man who'd stood alone for so long that the idea of having someone next to him had become a far-off dream. But now, it wasn't just a dream anymore. I can do that, he said. She gave him a small nod. Get some sleep, she said. You've got an early ride in the morning. He turned to go. Elias. He stopped. Thank you, she said, for the deed, and for not telling me until you were absolutely certain. She paused. I was right that you should have told me sooner. And you were right that you needed to be sure first. Both of those things can be true at the same time. He was quiet for a second. I ain't never had anyone say that to me before. What's that? That two things that seem to flat out contradict each other can both be true. She looked him straight in the eye. "Welcome to bein', folks," she said. He made a sound, short and startled, almost a chuckle. It was the kind of noise that escapes when something catches you clean off guard. She had never heard him laugh before. It was a good sound. She tucked it away in her mind without even thinking about it. "Sleep," she said one more time. He left. She stood right there in the middle of her kitchen for a good long time after the door to the lean-to had shut. Then she walked over to the main door and made sure the rifle hanging above the frame was loaded. It was. She'd done that same check every single night for 3 long years. Tonight was the first night she did it not out of fear, but from the simple, clean grit of a woman who knew what she owned, knew what it was worth, and had decided, completely and finally, with every ounce of her soul, that she was done letting anyone try to take it from her. She went to bed. She slept. And somewhere far down that southern trail, a rider was already turning his horse to head back north. Elias rode out before the sun had even peeked over the eastern ridge line. Clara heard his horse on the trail in that faint gray light before 5 in the morning, and she knew the sound of a rider with a purpose. It wasn't the lazy, ambling rhythm of a man with nowhere to be, but the sharp, steady clip-clop of someone with a job to do, and every intention of getting it done. She lay still for a minute, listening as the sound faded on down the valley. Then she got herself up, dressed, and put the coffee on. The cabin felt different with him gone. She noticed it, and she didn't much like that she did. She ate her breakfast standing right at the work counter, going over everything in her head the same way she surveyed her land each morning, checking for rot, looking for weak spots, searching for anything that needed her attention before it grew into a real problem. She thought about Tom Aldis riding south toward Pueblo. She thought about that notarized deed. She thought about 6 days, maybe less, maybe even tomorrow, and the cold, careful way Elias had said it. She thought about the rifle waiting over her door. Then she stepped outside and started working in the garden before the heat got too heavy. She was busy pulling weeds from her kitchen plot. The summer morning was already settling its weight on her shoulders when she heard a horse coming up from the south. It wasn't Elias. It was too early for that, and he was coming from the wrong direction. She rose up slow and turned, her hands covered in dirt, her face wearing that neutral, waiting look she had perfected, the one that gave nothing away. It was Hattie Greer, not the Greer boy who usually brought the mail. It was Hattie, all 62 years of her, with a spine as straight as a fence post. She had the look of a woman who caught wind of something serious and rode 8 miles on a Tuesday morning to handle it herself. She pulled her horse to a stop at the garden gate and looked at Clara with eyes that were sharp but kind. "Your man came by our place," she said. "Woke my husband and me before the sun was even up. Stood right there in our kitchen and told us the whole story." "He is not my man," Clara said firmly. "I am well aware of that," Hattie replied. "May I come down?" Hattie swung off her horse with the easy grace of a woman who had been doing it for 50 years and saw no need to make a show of it. She tied her horse to the gate, walked straight up to Clara, and looked her right in the eye. "Gerald is riding out to get the other men on the Valley Council this morning," she explained. "He will have all 4 of them together before noon. We are going to do this by the book, Clara. There will be notes taken, signatures on the land claim papers, and sworn statements from Gerald and me confirming we heard Tom Aldis's story from Elias Mercer's own mouth before any trouble got started." Clara felt a knot in her chest finally start to come undone. "Hattie, do not you thank me yet," Hattie said, her tone all business. "There is something else. Cole Ransom was over at the Dunut Ranch last night. Dunut's boy was up in the hayloft and kept quiet. He heard Ransom talking to Dunut about everything happening up here. Ransom knows about Tom Aldis. He just does not know that the boy came to you. He thinks Aldis just up and quit the crew. He has not done anything yet, but he knows what Aldis is aware of." "They will catch Tom before he ever makes it to Pueblo," Clara said, her voice hollow. "That is what Gerald is figuring," Hattie confirmed. "He sent our oldest son south this morning to ride with Aldis for the rest of the way. Two men are a lot harder to stop than one, and our boy knows the secret trail through the canyon. Clara just stared at her. For 8 years, this woman had been her closest neighbor. She brought food when Jeb first vanished without ever asking a single prying question. She rode out in the freezing cold of February in 1874 to tell her the news about Jeb in Pueblo. Then she handed her a jar of preserved plums on her way out, a small, quiet act of kindness. "You have been watching over me," Clara said, the truth of it hitting her all at once. "This entire time." Hattie made a little sound that was not quite a denial. "Women look out for other women in this tough country. It is not about being charitable, it is just common sense." She paused. "How are you doing?" The question was direct. Not "how is the farm holding up?" Not "how are things?" but "how are you, Clara?" Standing right here in your garden with dirt on your hands and maybe 6 days of trouble stretched out in front of you. "Angry," Clara answered. "That is a new feeling for me, and it is a better one." Hattie nodded like that was the only right answer in the world. "Good. Anger builds walls. Being afraid just makes you lock your doors." She stayed for an hour drinking coffee on the porch. They talked about practical things like what the Valley Council could do and what it could not. They discussed what a traveling judge might decide and what the schedule would look like if Tom Aldis got to Pueblo and came back with a lawyer before Saturday. Hattie was direct, specific, and did not waste a single word. By the time she rode back down the trail, Clara felt less like a woman waiting for something awful to happen, and more like a woman who was already deciding what would happen next. It was at that very moment she found the note. She was going back inside when she spotted it, tucked under the water bucket on the porch railing. It was a folded piece of paper with no envelope. She picked it up and unfolded it. There were only 8 words written in a handwriting she recognized immediately. It was slanted and pressed down hard like a man who learned to write but never enjoyed it. "Come out or I will burn you out, J." The paper was dry. It had been left recently, but not this morning. The fold was light but set like it had been carried in a pocket for a while. Someone had left it in the dark last night while she slept, while Elias was in the lean-to only 12 feet away. They had come that close. Someone had walked right onto her porch in the middle of the night, left that note, and vanished without a sound. Her hands did not tremble. They wanted to, but she told them no. She laid the note on the table, smoothed it flat, and walked back out to her garden. There were certain things in this life that just had to be done, and being scared was not a good enough reason to not do them. She was still out there when Elias returned. He came up the path at a pace that was not quite a run, but it was fast enough to make her put down her trowel and stand up. He swung down from his horse before it had even stopped moving. She could tell by the hard line of his jaw that he had news. It was not good news, and he had been holding it inside for the last mile home. "Notarized," he said first. "The deed is documented and witnessed. Gerald Greer has a copy. The records office has a copy, and I have one." "Good," she said. "There is a note on the table." He went inside and read it, then came back out. His face went very still. It was a look she recognized as him thinking, instead of just reacting. He was sorting through it, weighing it, and deciding what the information truly meant, not just how it felt. "Someone was here last night," he said. "Yes, he is watching the place." Elias said the note was not from Jeb himself. "Jeb would not come leave it. That is a job for Cole Ransom. He was here last night, which means our timeline just got moved up." Clara said, "The timeline has moved up." Elias nodded. "And there is something else." He took a breath. "I talked to a man in town, Frank Doss. He runs the livery stable. He told me 3 strangers came through 2 days ago. They were asking for directions to the valley properties north of Segundo. They are almost certainly Jeb's men, and they are already in the area. Clara, they are not coming from Pueblo or Trinidad. They are already here, somewhere up in the high country." The garden suddenly felt exposed and dangerous. "How many?" she asked. Doss counted 3 horses. Jeb plus Cole plus 1 other. Tom said he had 2 men besides Cole, that is still 3 total, the same number, and Tom Aldis is still riding for Pueblo. Gerald Greer's boy is with him. Elias said, "They will make it, but they will not get back before this all comes to a head." "So we do not have 6 days," she said. "We do not have 6 days," he said. She looked him square in the eye. "Tonight or tomorrow." The note says, "Burn you out." Burning needs darkness. It is easier to claim it was an accident in the middle of the night. He met her gaze. "I think tonight is more likely than tomorrow." Clara looked back at her cabin. She looked at the roof Elias had mended, at the porch beam that no longer squeaked, at the window that was finally clean from the old black smoke stains. "No," she said. Elias looked at her. "No, what? No. I am not going to spend my night sitting inside just waiting for some man to come and put a match to what is mine." She turned to face him directly. "You said you would stand next to me while I fight. That is still what I'm asking." "I know," he said. "I am still standing right here, am I not?" The steady way he said it hit her in a way she did not expect. He was not trying to act tough. He was not putting on a show. He was just there. He was like the fixed porch beam, just there, not making a big fuss about it. He was not looking for any thanks, just present and solid and ready to take the weight. "What do we do?" she asked. "We do not wait in the dark," he said. "We make this entire thing public before they can keep it quiet. I want to ride out to the Dunnett place and the Harlow claim and the Frederick homestead. I want to tell them exactly what I told Gerald Greer this morning. I want there to be 6 families who know the whole story before the sun goes down, because Jeb can handle 1 woman all by herself, but he cannot handle 1 woman with 6 Valley families watching his every move." "That will take most of the day," she said. "Yes, and it leaves this place unguarded." "I will ask Mrs. Greer to send her daughter to stay with you while I ride," he said. Clara's jaw set hard. "I do not need—" "You are alone on a property that a man threatened in writing last night," Elias said. His voice was not mean or bossy, just stating a fact. "Having someone here is not about whether you can handle it alone. It is about making sure there is a second person to see whatever happens and ride for help if it is needed." She took a deep breath. "All right," she said. "I will be back before dark," he promised. "You had better be," she told him. He was already untying his horse. He did make it back before dark, but just barely. The light was turning to gold and casting long shadows over the ridge when he finally rode up the track. She could see a certain tightness in the way he sat his horse from clear across the yard, even before he was close enough to make out his face. She got up from her chair. Hattie's daughter, Risa, all of 17 years old with steady eyes, came to the door right behind her. "Get your horse," Elias said to Risa, "and ride home the long way round. Don't you take that south track." Risa looked over at Clara. "Go on," Clara said. And Risa went. Elias swung down from his horse, took the porch steps in 2 long strides, and said, "Cole Ransom is over at the Dunnett place. He was there when I got to the Fredericks. I saw his horse at the rail from up on the ridge and turned my own horse around before he could spot me. He's moving out ahead of me, talking to the same families, telling them—" "What?" "I don't know for sure. But the Fredericks had a whole different look about them when I was leaving than they did when I rode up. Whatever Ransom told them this morning, it left a mark. It left—" "What kind of mark?" Elias was quiet for just a second too long. "He told them about my warrant," he said. "Not that it was dismissed, mind you, just that I had one. And he told them—" He stopped. "What?" "He told them I had a history with a Lakota girl. The way he told it, I didn't stop a thing. I started it." The whole world around Clara went perfectly still. She understood exactly what Ransom had done. It was like cutting a man open with words. You take the one thing he's most proud of, the one right thing he did in a long stretch of doing wrong, and you twist it and turn it until it looks like the worst thing he ever did. You take the truth and just bend it enough so it still has the shape of truth. And in 1876, in a high Colorado valley full of families who did not know Elias Mercer from any other wanderer with a rifle and a past, it would surely work. "Did any of them ask you about it straight out?" she said. "The Fredericks did. I told them the whole story. The girl, the sheriff's son, the warrant, the dismissal. I told them I had the paperwork to prove it. Did they believe you?" "I do not know," he said. The husband looked like he wanted to. The wife, not so much. Clara turned and walked back inside the cabin. She went over to the small writing shelf, took out some paper and a pen, and sat herself down at the table. "What are you doing?" Elias asked from the doorway. "Writin'," she said. She wrote for a solid 10 minutes. He did not bother her. She could feel him just standing there in the doorway, not crowding her, just being there, while she wrote down the clearest, most honest story she could about Elias Boone Mercer. She wrote about what he had done the day he showed up, what he had told her, what the deed search had cost him in his own time and sweat, everything he had done, and more important, everything he had not done. That was the part that counted most. The long list of things he could have done, but did not. The list of lines he could have crossed, but chose to stay behind. She signed her name and put the date on it. She folded the paper and looked up at him. "Take this to Gerald Greer tonight," she told him. "Have him read it out loud at the Valley Council meeting." "Clara, I know what Ransom is doing," she said. "He is not trying to convince the Valley families that you are dangerous. He is trying to convince them to stay out of it, to decide this mess is too complicated, too much trouble, and better left alone. He needs them to look the other way." She held out the letter. "This is why they should not." Elias looked from the letter in her hand back to her face. "You did not have to do this," he said. "You looked up my deed," she answered. "Now we are even." He took the letter from her. He held it gently, the same way he held that coffee cup, like he was aware of its importance. He said, "I will be back." "I know," she told him. After he rode away, she took the rifle down from its spot above the door. She sat in the chair that faced it, made herself eat something, and forced her mind to think clearly. Jeb was somewhere out in the territory. His hired muscle was right here. Cole Ransom was pulling every string he could to make sure that when things finally happened, there would not be a single witness left in the valley, and no help from the community. Tom Aldis was still 2 days from Pueblo, which meant 2 days to get back. The circuit judge was a week away, if she got lucky. She was just one woman, all alone on a stretch of dark land with a rifle in her lap, a letter on its way, and the futures of 6 valley families hanging on what happened next. She thought about what Hattie had told her. Anger builds walls. Being scared just locks the doors. She was not scared. Model. She kept poking at that feeling, the way you would test a sore spot to see if it was bruised or truly broken. She looked for fear, but all she could find was a cold, sharp anger that showed her exactly where she had drawn her line in the dirt, and how far she was willing to go to defend it. When the knock on the door finally came, it was nothing like before. It was not polite. It was not patient. It was a man's fist hitting the wood 3 hard times with the kind of power that does not ask for permission. Clara rose from her chair, rifle in hand, and called out loud and clear, "I have a gun. State your name and your business." There were about 2 seconds of silence. Then came a voice she had not heard in 3 long years. "It is your husband, Clara. Open this door." Jeb Whitlock's voice had not improved with time. It was the same one she recalled. It was not loud or booming, but it had the weight of a man who always got what he wanted just by making people believe they had no other choice. "This is my property," she answered, her own voice steady. "Your name is not on any deed, and you have no legal right to be on this land. Go away, Jeb. I am not going anywhere. Then you can stand out there until sunrise. I will ride to the settlement then, and have the law formally remove you," she said. "One way or another, you are not coming through my door." There was a pause. "Cole tells me there is a man staying here. There is a man here doing work for pay on my property. He sleeps in the lean-to. He is my employee. You do not get a say in the matter. He is a wanted man. His warrant was dismissed 2 years ago. I have the signed papers right here to prove it." A quiet moment passed. She could hear the scuff of boots on the porch boards. They were shifting around, checking things out, circling like vultures. It was more than one fella out there. "Open this door, Clara. Do not you make this tougher than it needs to be." "Jeb," she answered, "I need you to hear me and hear me well. I am holding a rifle. I am also holding a land deed, notarized and filed. I have sworn statements from the Valley Council detailing what you are up to, given to them by someone who saw it all. And I have a letter from that same witness that is on its way to the Public Lands Bureau right this second. If you put so much as a scratch on this place or give me trouble on my own land, there are 6 families in this valley who know enough to see you pay for it." The world went silent. She felt the thump of her own heart in her chest. 1, 2, 3 beats. Then she heard Jeb's voice again, quieter this time. There was a real mean streak hiding under it now. "You have gotten mighty bold. I have gotten mighty informed," she shot back. "There is a world of difference. Where is that mountain man of yours now? He is close enough." It was a bluff saying that. She had no earthly idea where Elias was. He could still be over at the Greer place, or maybe he was already heading back. But she said it with every ounce of certainty she could find, because certainty was the only weapon she had left. And she learned a long time ago that when you are on the losing end of a fight, looking sure of yourself can be its own kind of firepower. The boots on the porch shuffled again. She followed the noise, just the way her daddy showed her. 2 men for sure, maybe a third slinking around the side of the house. "I'm going to count to 3, Jeb called out, "and when I hit 2, I am sending a bullet right through this door at about the height of your chest." Clara said, "You go right ahead and give it your best shot." A long, heavy silence stretched out. Then she heard the sound of boots stepping off the porch. They were backing off, not running, keeping it calm and measured. It was the kind of retreat a man makes when he's mad as a hornet but not a fool. A man who was rethinking his play, not giving up on the game. She did not move a muscle. She just stood there in her kitchen, that rifle aimed square at the door, and she held her ground for a good 10 minutes. She did not so much as move her feet or try to loosen the knot in her shoulders. She stood stock still and she listened. She heard horses moving off, heading down toward the south track. They were not gone, just finding a new spot. She crept over to the window, staying to one side so she would not be a target, and peered out into the dark yard. 3 horses stood near the trees, far enough away to be mistaken for shadows. They were waiting. They figured they could just wait her out. They would wait until she had to sleep, or until Elias came riding back all alone on a trail where 3 men were lying in wait, or until the sun came up and they could try something different. Her mind started sorting through her options, quick and sharp. She knew she could not stay awake forever, and she could not let Elias ride headlong into an ambush on that south track without so much as a warning. She moved to the back of the cabin, to the window with a view of the lean-to in the barn. She slid it open, slow and quiet as a mouse. Nobody was on this side. She could still make out the 3 horses down by the south line of trees. They had not thought to split up and surround the place. That was the mistake they made. She grabbed her rifle. She slipped out the back window. In 15 seconds, she was on the ground, using the dark wall of the barn as cover and making for the paddock where she kept her horse. She got him saddled in the pitch black. She had done it 1,000 times and did not need any light. She led the horse out the north gate of the paddock, away from the woods, and into the high grass behind the barn. Then she swung herself up onto his back and she rode. Not down the south track where they were laying in wait, but north, up the ridge trail into the high country. She knew every twist and gully and rock up there, and Jeb Whitlock's hired guns did not know a thing about it. She would make a big circle and come down the back trail that ran west of the main settlement road. She would get to Elias before Jeb's men ever could, and she sure as heck was not going to be in that cabin when they finally got tired of waiting. The horse moved steady and sure beneath her in the darkness, because he was her horse, and he knew these hills as well as she did. And Clara May Whitlock rode with that rifle laid across her saddle, her jaw set like stone, the night air sharp on her cheeks, and a feeling deep in her chest that was as clear and true as a bell. She had been waiting for 3 long years. She was all done with waiting now. The trail was skinny and the night was as black as coal. Somewhere down the hill, 3 men were keeping an eye on an empty cabin. And somewhere on the settlement road, a man who had stayed put when he could have just left was riding toward a fight she had no intention of letting him walk into all by himself. She nudged her horse into a faster gait. The ridge loomed up dark and solid on all sides, and the stars were like tiny, sharp diamonds, the way they only are in the high country during the summer. And Clara May Whitlock kept riding through the dark toward the only outcome she would ever accept. Her land, her good name, her own choice, and the sound of hoofbeats just up ahead on the west trail that she was almost positive, almost completely certain belonged to a horse she recognized. "Elias," she called out into the night. Up ahead, the sound stopped. "Clara." She pushed her horse on. "They are down at the south tree line," she said, coming up right next to him on the tight path. "3 of them. Jeb is with them." I climbed out the back window. He just stared at her. She could see his face plain enough in the starlight. And what she saw there was not shock or praise or even being relieved. It was something more tangled up than that, and a lot more honest. "You rode out through the back. I was not about to let you ride back alone on that track," she told him. "I know," he said. "Greer, Gerald is riding with a couple of councilmen. They're about 20 minutes behind me." "20 minutes?" she asked. 20 minutes, he said again. She thought about those 3 men waiting by the south trees, about Jeb figuring out his next move, about Cole Ransom, who was always so cautious about having witnesses, and about the note that promised he would burn you out. "They will see we are both gone from the house," she said. "They will head inside the cabin." "I know. The cabin is just 4 walls and a roof," he said. "You can always build another one." "You fixed that roof," she said. The words just came spilling out before she could make them sound any less wounded. "I know," he answered, his voice low. "And that is not a small thing to me. But it is not worth you, and it is not worth letting Jeb get his way. You found yourself in a tight spot, facing down 3 armed fellas in a dark cabin all by your lonesome." She looked him square in the eye through the gloom. 20 minutes, she stated. "If Gerald rides like the wind, Jeb has no idea the council is on its way." "No," Elias confirmed, "he does not." The night was dead silent all around them. "So we head back," Clara declared. "But not on the south track. We will come in from the north, the same way I came out. And we are going to make a whole lot of racket coming down that ridge, so they know we are there before we even show up." "You want them to know we are coming?" he asked. "I want them to have to make a choice," she said. "In the dark, on my land, with Valley Council members 20 minutes out. They need to decide if this is still the night they thought it was when they first rode up." Elias was quiet for a beat. "You are not scared," he said. "I am scared to death," she admitted. "But I am a heck of a lot more angry than I am scared. And I reckon that will have to be good enough." A look passed over his face in the shadows, something she could not quite name and did not have a moment to decipher. "All right," he said. "We ride back." They turned their mounts and headed for the North Ridge path. High above them, the summer stars were like cold, hard diamonds. Down below, near the southern line of trees, 3 fellas were about to find out the woman they aimed to scare off had not been sitting around waiting. She had gone to fetch her own kind of help, and bless their hearts, she was on her way back now. They came clattering down that ridge path, not making any effort to be quiet. That was all according to the plan, an idea of Clara's that Elias took to right away. He understood it the way a good horseman understands a green colt without needing a word of instruction. You do not sneak up on 3 armed men in the pitch dark when you are on your own land. You let them know you are coming, loud and clear, so they have to decide who they are before the bullets start flying. The sound of the horseshoes on the stone path rang out in the dark summer air like a deliberate tolling of a bell. Clara held her rifle steady across her saddle. Elias rode just ahead and to her left, his own rifle in his hand. He was not aiming it, not itching for a fight, but it was there. It was a fact, just like a mountain is a fact. They rounded the northern curve of the property and the cabin finally appeared. For one heart-stopping second, Clara imagined the worst. She half expected to see the orange flicker of flames, to smell the harsh bite of smoke, and to know she had misjudged everything. But the cabin stood there dark and whole, exactly as she had left it. And the 3 horses were still over by the south trees, just where she had seen their tracks, waiting. Except now, they were not waiting so patiently. Now, they were moving. She saw 3 figures detached from the trees as she and Elias made their way down the ridge. They broke from the darkness and became men on horseback, and the whole picture of the standoff became clear in an instant. 2 riders coming down from the north, 3 men waiting by the trees, and her cabin sitting right there in the middle, the very thing they were all fixin' to fight over. "Jeb," Clara called out. Her voice was as solid as an old oak, not a single tremor in it. It was the voice she used when she meant every word down to the bone. "My name is on this deed. That deed is filed and proper with the county clerk. I have got a witness on record down in Pueblo, and members of the Valley Council are about 20 minutes behind us on this very trail. Whatever business you thought you had here tonight, you better think real hard if it is worth the trouble that is coming right after." The only answer from the trees was silence. Then Jeb Whitlock nudged his horse forward, stepping out of the shadows and into the open ground. And Clara got her first good look at the man in 3 long years. He was leaner. That was the first thing she noticed, though she had not expected it to matter. And it did not, but she saw it anyway. He was thinner and his face was drawn tight, with the hard jaw of a man who had spent too long with a bottle and not enough time with a plate. He looked like a worn-out version of himself that had been left in the sun too long. "You brought help," he said, his eyes on Elias. "I brought an employee," she said back. "And you brought 3. Cole mentioned this fella has a record. Cole tells you a lot of stories that are missing the last chapter," she replied. "The warrant for Elias Mercer was thrown out back in 1874 by a judge who heard the whole truth. If Cole conveniently forgot to tell you that part, you should probably ask him why." Jeb's gaze slid over to Elias. Something flickered in his eyes. A quick calculation, a weighing of odds, that certain look a man gets when he's trying to figure out if he can take the other fella. "Big man," Jeb muttered. "Jeb," Elias said. His voice was level, not looking for a fight, but not giving an inch of ground either. It was like a heavy door bolted from the inside. "I know what you told those men in the saloon back in Trinidad. About the deed, about this piece of land. You were drunk and your mouth was going, and I was sitting just 2 tables away. I have held on to that little piece of information for 2 years. The quiet that fell after that was a different kind of silence. Jeb went stiff as a board. "I do not know you," he said. "You did not see me," Elias answered. "That does not mean I was not there." The way Jeb held himself changed. The arithmetic he was doing in his head was suddenly all wrong. This was a new number that did not fit, and Clara could see him trying to work the problem, and she could see he did not like the answer he was coming up with one bit. From the tree line, Cole Ransom's voice cut in, calm and steady. "Jeb, let us go." "I am not done," Jeb snapped, his eyes still fixed on Elias. "Yes," Cole said, and his tone left no room for argument. "You are." Clara turned her head. Cole Ransom was not looking at Jeb, nor was he looking at Elias. His gaze was fixed on the north track, the one behind her and Elias. And in that look, Clara saw something that caught her off guard. It was something that made her reconsider everything she thought she knew about Cole Ransom, but not in a way she would have ever guessed. The man was afraid. He was not scared of Elias, and he was not scared of her. He was scared of the hornet's nest that Tom Aldis had just kicked over. "Cole," she said, and his eyes met hers. "You know this is done," she stated plainly. "Whatever Jeb told you, whatever kind of deal he promised, you know good and well that Tom Aldis is in Pueblo at this very moment. You know this deed is legitimate. You know I have the support of the Valley Council." She let the words hang in the night air. "You are a cautious man. You have always been cautious. Be cautious right now." A change flickered across Cole's face. She could not put a name to it. He was not a man to show his feelings openly, but he turned his horse. He offered no word to Jeb. He made no excuses, gave no reason, and did not even glance back. He simply turned his horse and rode off into the southern darkness. The third rider, a young man she did not know who was little more than a shadow, followed right on his heels without a sound. It was the way young men follow when an older man makes a sudden choice, and following seems to be the only sensible option. And just like that, Jeb found himself standing all alone in the yard. He watched the two horses vanish. He looked at Clara. He looked at Elias. He was doing his sums again, but the numbers were just not adding up right anymore, no matter which way he figured them, and she could see it plain as day on his face. It was the unmistakable look of a man who rode up expecting to deal with a lone woman, and instead found a completely different situation waiting for him. "You think this is finished?" he sneered. "I think tonight is finished," Clara said calmly. "And I think you ought to leave before the council arrives. Because if Gerald Greer discovers you on my land in the dark after what Tom Aldis told him, the conversation you have with him will be a whole lot more unpleasant than the one you are having with me." "This is still my—" "No, it is not," she cut him off sharply. "It has not been yours since the moment you left. It was never yours in the way you believed it was. Go on now, Jeb. Just go." He stared at her for a long, hard moment. She held his gaze without flinching, her expression firm, giving him absolutely nothing to argue against. It was just a clear, steady, and final answer to a question he had been asking ever since he walked out on her. She did not belong to him. This place did not belong to him. There was nothing left here for him to claim. He turned his horse. He rode south. She watched until the sound of the hoofbeats faded completely into the night. Then her hands, which had been as steady as a rock through the entire confrontation, began to shake. It was not a big, dramatic tremor, just that fine, quick trembling that happens when your body finally releases a tension it has held on to for far too long. She tightened her grip on the stock of her rifle and breathed through it, careful not to make a sound. Elias dismounted from his horse and came to stand beside her. He did not make a move toward her. He simply stood with his hand on the neck of her horse and asked softly, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she answered. "Just need a moment." He granted her that moment. She took it, breathing deep until the shaking stopped, letting it work its way out of her. She willed her hands to be still again, and after a short while they obeyed. She slid down from the saddle. She was standing in her own yard, on her own piece of dirt, beneath a sky full of summer stars. She looked at her cabin, at her roof, her porch, her chimney standing strong, and a single thought filled her mind. It held. The whole place held. "You had a feeling he would back off," she said to Elias. "I had a feeling Cole would," he replied. "Cole's got an instinct for saving his own hide that is a whole lot sharper than Jeb's pride." As soon as Cole rode off, Jeb knew he was standing there all by himself. "But you were not completely sure, were you?" "No," he admitted. "I was not completely sure. And you still came down that ridge. You came down it first," he said plainly. "I was just following your lead." She looked straight at him. "Do not do that." "Do what?" "Talk down what you did. You knew 3 armed men were in this yard and you rode in anyway. So did you." "This is my home," she said. "It was mine too," he said. "For a time." Those words just hung there in the quiet between them. They both felt the meaning behind them, but neither was ready to say more on it. Not just yet. Because hoofbeats were getting closer on the north track, and 6 minutes later Gerald Greer appeared with 2 councilmen. And just like that, the night became about practical matters for a good long while. Gerald was the sort of fellow who needed to talk a problem all the way through to get a handle on it. And he talked for a good 20 minutes, absorbing the night's events, with the keen attention of a man building a court case inside his own head. While he listened, he posed very specific questions. He directed them to Clara first, then to Elias, and then circled back to Clara one more time. He did not jot down a single note. He had not brought any paper, but Clara had a strong sense that every single word was being sorted and tucked away behind his steady gray eyes. When he was finally satisfied, he looked at the two of them. "Cole Ransom leaving when he did," he said. "That is a big deal. A man like Cole does not just ride away from a fight unless he has already decided it is a lost cause. He will not be coming back." He paused. "And Jeb," Clara had said. Gerald was silent for a bit. "Jeb is a man full of pride. Proud men do not always make the wisest decisions. But proud men who get made to look like fools in front of their own crew, well, they tend to need some time to lick their wounds before they try anything again. You have bought yourself some breathing room, Clara. Make good use of it." He continued. "The circuit judge, PBLO, is 3 days south of here. Tom Aldis arrives there tomorrow afternoon, and that is the absolute earliest. Figure another day for the judge to hear the whole story and draw up the legal papers. You are looking at 5 days at a minimum before anyone with real legal power can get here. And for those 5 days," Gerald declared, "you will not be on this land by yourself. I am sending my second boy up here in the morning. He can bed down in the barn. And first thing tomorrow, I am going to have a word with the Fredericks and the Harlows and the Dunits about what a real community watch is for when a neighbor truly needs it." He turned his gaze to Elias. "You are staying," he stated. It was not a question. "I am staying," Elias confirmed. Gerald gave a firm nod, then looked back to Clara. "You handled this situation better than most men I know would have." "I have had 3 years of practice being ready for it," she replied. He and his councilman rode off an hour later, and the property fell quiet once more. It was a different sort of quiet than the tense silence from before. This was a cleared quiet, not a waiting one. It was the kind of peace you feel in a field after a big storm has finally rolled on through. Clara put on a pot of coffee. She and Elias sat together on the porch. They existed in the darkness, letting the special stillness that only comes after the sun is gone settle all around them. "Tom Aldis," she finally said into the night. "He is on his way," Elias replied. "The very day that Judge arrives, I am filing the divorce papers," she went on. "I want everything taken care of at once. I do not want this thing stretched out over 2 different court dates. I want 1 single day to put this all behind me. Gerald can arrange that." "I know." A quiet moment passed between them. "I have been his wife in the eyes of the law for 11 years. The day I am no longer his wife has to be the same day he answers for what he tried to do tonight." Elias nodded slowly. He cupped his coffee mug with both hands and gazed out at the dark outline of the ridge. "What happens next?" he asked. His question was careful, its real meaning hiding in plain sight, the way important questions often do. It hinted at something without saying it outright. "After," she said, "I have a piece of land with a clean title and a roof that does not leak. I have a letter making its way to my daughter, a letter she might not even bother to open. I have a garden that needs to be harvested before the first frost, and a north wall that needs reinforcing. And I have a legal battle that is finally about to go my way." She took a breath. "I have more than enough after to keep me occupied." "You know that is not what I was asking," he said, his voice soft. She turned to look at him. His eyes were still fixed on the ridge, not on her. He was offering her a way out, a chance to pretend she did not understand, to just let the matter drop, to leave his question hanging in the air for another time, or maybe forever. "I know what you were getting at," she said. "I told you I would be moving on," he said. "I figured 2 weeks, 3 at the most. I said the foundation would need more than that. And he had been right. It had needed more time. But the foundation was solid as a rock now. And Elias, he began, letting his voice trail off. The east corner, she said, cutting him off. You found that problem with the east corner. It is fixed. I know. Another silence stretched out. There is an issue with the north wall, a bigger one than just shoring it up. The timber frame on the inside of that wall has not been right since that terrible winter back in 1873. I have been patching it the best I could. I have not been able to fix it properly. He went completely still. I do not know the first thing about timber framing, she said, but I reckon a man who can figure out a chimney draft in a foundation corner could likely take a look and tell me what needs to be done. The silence that followed felt different from all the others that had come before it. It had a new kind of weight to it. It was the silence of two people standing on a narrow step, their shoulders nearly touching, and both of them aware of it. I could take a look at it, he said. In the morning, she said. In the morning, he echoed. She went back into the house. He stayed right there on the step, and she lay in the darkness of her room for a long while, just listening to the sounds of a summer night and, later, the quiet rustle of him getting settled in the lean-to. And she thought about 11 years and 3 years and 14 days, and how people say time moves in a straight line, but it certainly does not feel that way. That night, she slept without the rifle near her. She did not even notice until the sun was already up. The 5 days that followed felt like letting go of a breath you did not even know you had been holding. Gerald Greer's second son, a serious 15-year-old boy named William, arrived the next morning with a bedroll. He had a straightforward manner that reminded Clara of his mother, and she liked him instantly. He made a spot for himself in the barn without a single complaint, asked where he could be the most help, and then simply set to work without needing to be told again. Elias checked the framing on the north wall that very first morning. He said a 12-foot section of it would have to be replaced from the ground up, and that it would be 4 full days of hard labor. He said it with the same plain confidence he had used when he told her the porch beam would take an afternoon. And Clara asked, how much for the wood? He named a fair price, and she just answered, fine. And that was the end of the discussion. There were no long-winded explanations and no haggling over the price, just two people who had found a way to work alongside each other and were sticking to it. The valley itself felt different during those 5 days. It seemed quieter on the surface, but she knew the real story from Hattie's daily updates. Hattie sent a message over every morning with the milk from the Greer farm, a small folded note tucked into the lid of the jar. Clara found it to be both practical and kind. The notes let her know that things were not quiet at all. Gerald had paid a visit to all 6 families in the valley. The Fredericks started singing a different tune once they heard the whole truth from Gerald instead of just the half-story from Cole. The Dunits were keeping their opinions to themselves but had agreed to the plan to watch over things. The Harlows sent their oldest daughter up with a jar of honey and a note that just said, "We are keeping an eye on the South Track." That was all it needed to say. Cole Ransom was not seen again. Jeb was not seen again. The South Track remained quiet, and that quiet felt like a different kind of creature now. It was not the quiet of something waiting for its moment, but the quiet of something that had been beaten back and was still trying to figure out a new way to get in. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived. Clara was at her work table when William came back from the mail run holding a little envelope. He had that look on his face a boy gets when he knows he is holding something important, even if he does not understand why. She took it from him, and a feeling seized her chest even before her brain could recognize the handwriting she had not laid eyes on in 5 years. The postmark read Missouri. Her hands began to shake with that same tremor, the kind that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with something huge happening all at once. She went straight to the table and sat. She ripped the envelope open. The letter inside was 3 pages long, written front and back in her daughter's script. It was the same handwriting that had taken shape at this very table, a hand Clara had guided on cold winter evenings 20 years back, when Hannah was just a little thing, and the world outside was frozen solid, and the cabin had felt warm and complete and safe. She read the letter once. Then she read it all over again. She laid it on the table, placed her hands flat on either side of it, and just looked at it, not saying a thing for a good long while. William had the sense to go back outside. When Elias came in for some water later in the day, he saw the look on her face, and he paused in the doorway. "Good news or bad?" he asked. "Both," she answered. "She is coming home. Is coming." He did not say anything. He just stood there and waited. "She has been waiting," Clara said, touching the letter. That is what she wrote, word for word. "She has been waiting for a letter from me that did not start with the words 'I am sorry.'" And when she got this one, she read it 4 times in one day. Clara's voice was solid, but just barely. "She says she has been with her aunt, but her aunt is not doing well, and it was never a permanent arrangement. She has been trying to figure out what comes next. She says—" Clara stopped. "Take your time," he told her gently. "She says she needs to know if the valley is really like she remembers it, or if she has just built it up in her mind," Clara went on. "She says she is not promising anything. She says she will come for a visit, just to have a look." "That is enough," Elias said. "But is it?" "It is a start," he told her. "That is all a visit is meant to be." She looked down at the letter, at Hannah's handwriting, a grown woman's now, not the little girl who ran away. She is 21 years old. She has been gone since she was 16. 5 years. "I do not even know who she is anymore. I reckon she does not know you either," he said. "Not the woman you are these days. You all are both going to have to get to know each other all over again." "Does that scare you?" she asked. She was not even sure why she was asking him. It was not his trouble to worry about, but she asked him anyway. "When my mother was dying," he said, "I went back home after I had been gone for 3 years. She did not ask me where I had been or why it took me so long to come back. She just asked if I was hungry." He took a long breath. "We did not fix everything that was busted between us. But we ate supper together. We talked about the weather and about a horse she had bought the spring before. And by the time I had to go, we had found enough common ground to stand on." Another moment passed. Sometimes you can't fix it all. Sometimes you just need a solid patch of ground to start building on again. She looked over at him. "You never told me about your mother," she said. "You never asked." "I am asking now." He settled into the chair across from her, not just on the edge or keeping his distance, but sitting down like a man who felt he had a right to be there. "She passed on 2 years ago before I made my way north. She was a strong, practical woman who never wasted words, and she died in her own bed under her own roof, which was all she had ever wanted." "You were with her?" "I was with her." "Good," Clara said with a soft voice. "Yes," he said. They sat together at the table in the stillness of the afternoon, letting the silence be a comfortable companion. It was not the wary silence of 2 people keeping their guard up. It was the easy quiet that exists between 2 people who had given up trying to appear calm and were simply being themselves. Hannah's letter was lying on the table between them. "She will come for a visit," Clara thought to herself. "She will come and see the roof that held firm, the porch that sits level, and the path that does not get washed away by a summer storm. She will see what this place became after I stopped feeling sorry for it. She will see the 3rd chair." The thought appeared in her mind without an invitation, and she looked up to see Elias watching her. He had that patient, decent look she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man who understood how to make waiting mean something, instead of just letting time pass by. "The north wall," she said. "2 more days," he replied. "And after that, there is the south fence line," he said, and his voice was almost too casual, too matter-of-fact, in a way that did not quite conceal what lay beneath. "I noticed it last week. The 3rd post in from the corner is not set correctly. The first hard frost will push it right out of the ground if it is not reset." She held his gaze. "I reckon that is about a half-day's work," she said. "Probably," he agreed. And after that, he looked her right in the eyes. "I reckon there is always something around here that needs to be done," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked back to the work table, and said over her shoulder, "Supper will be at 6. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And this time, there was not a hint of distance in his words. On the 5th day, Tom Aldous returned. He came back with the Greer boy and a circuit judge named Hartwell, a man of 60 years who had sharp eyes and the kind of impatience that comes from seeing too many straightforward cases get needlessly complicated. He rode onto Clara's property at 11 o'clock in the morning, took Gerald Greer's sworn statement right there on her porch, reviewed the notarized deed, and carefully read Elias's written account of what happened at the Trinidad saloon. Then he gave Tom Aldous a full 45 minutes of his attention. He listened with the intense focus of a man who bills by the hour and makes every second productive. Then he directed his gaze at Clara and said, "Ma'am, I am going to need you to tell me in your own words exactly what happened on the night we are discussing. Do not omit a single detail, and do not include anything you cannot swear to." She told him everything. Her story was perfectly organized. It followed the sequence of events without a flaw. She spoke with a clarity that had been sharpened by 3 long years of waiting. She had replayed this exact moment in her head so many times that the words came out smoothly and confidently, without the stumbling that occurs when you are trying to assemble a story while telling it. She knew exactly what she had seen, what she had heard, and who had spoken every last word. When she had finished, Judge Hartwell made 3 brief notes on his paper, looked them over, and announced, "The divorce papers can be filed today. Abandonment for 3 years is a sufficient reason under Colorado territorial law. I will see to the filing myself, and it will be complete within 30 days. And regarding Jeb, what Mr. Whitlock did last night constitutes criminal trespass and making threats to destroy property. I am issuing a warrant for his arrest this afternoon. The county sheriff from Pueblo will be the one to deliver it." He looked at her over his paperwork. "He will have the option to leave the Colorado territory of his own accord before the warrant is delivered, an opportunity some men in his situation choose to accept. If he decides to stay, he will be arrested. And Cole ransom." Hartwell glanced over at Gerald Greer. Gerald spoke up, explaining that Cole had left the territory 2 days ago. Dunit's son saw him heading south with all his belongings packed up. He is not coming back. Clara allowed that information to sink in. "All right," she said. Hartwell had her place her signature on 4 separate documents. He had Elias and Gerald sign as witnesses, and by 1 in the afternoon he was already back on his horse. Tom Aldous rode south right there beside him, acting as the official witness to make sure the warrant held. When they reached the gate, Tom Aldous pulled his horse to a stop and looked back at Clara. "I sure am sorry I could not get here any faster," he said. "I rode with that bunch for 2 months before I got the true measure of them. Once I knew, I should have moved quicker." "You moved," she told him. "That is the part that counts." A determined look settled on his young face. "I wish you the best, Mrs. Whitlock." "That name will not be mine for much longer," she answered. He gave her a real smile, the first she had ever seen on his face, and then he rode on south. The yard grew quiet. Gerald Greer said his goodbyes and started back down the valley. William picked up his bedroll from the barn and left with his father, giving Clara a firm handshake at the gate. She accepted it with the same seriousness because the moment called for it. And then she was all by herself on her own land, with her signed papers in the summer afternoon, and Elias standing quietly at the corner of the porch. She stood right in the middle of the yard and took it all in. The cabin, the roof that had not let in a single drop from any summer storm, the porch that took her weight without a single groan, the chimney that pulled smoke up straight and true, the north wall just 2 days from being fully repaired, and the walkway to the gate, laid with flat stones that never budged in the rain. It was all hers. It was all safe. She heard the quiet sound of Elias's boots on the porch steps as he came to stand right beside her. Not one step behind her, not keeping a careful space right there next to her. Right there. She did not even turn her head. "It is over," she said. "The part with the law is," he replied. "The part with the law," she agreed. "The rest of it is going to take more time. Most things that are worth the trouble usually do." She finally turned then to look straight at him. There was something she had been holding inside for a while, something she had not yet said out loud. Not because of fear, but because saying it needed a deep-down kind of certainty that had taken its time to grow. She felt that certainty right then. "When Hannah gets home," she said, "I want her to meet you." He stood there perfectly still. "As the man who fixed my roof," she went on, "and the man who found my deed and the man who told me the truth, even when it came late and was not the whole story." She held his gaze without flinching. "And after that, as whatever else you happen to be by then." The summer afternoon seemed to just hang in the air around them, the high valley quiet and washed in golden light, with the mountains making a dark circle at the edge of the world. "Whatever else I am by then," he repeated real slow. "That is what I said." He gave one slow nod, the kind a man gives when he is accepting something he has been mighty cautious about accepting. He was cautious not because he did not want it, but because wanting things had brought him pain before, and he had learned to hold it at a distance until it proved it was real. "All right," he said. "South fence post," she said. "In the morning," he answered. "In the morning," she agreed. She went on back inside. Behind her, she heard him moving toward the north wall. There were still 2 days of work left to be done, and he was getting back to it, the same way he got back to everything, steady, without a hurry, and with his whole mind on it. She walked over to her little writing desk. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote, "Hannah, the legal trouble is all taken care of. Your room is still here waiting for you. Come home whenever you are ready. Mama." It was short. It was true. It was everything that needed to be said, and not one word more. She set it by the door for the morning mail. Then she tied on her apron and started making supper. From outside, she could hear the sound of work going on, the ring of a hammer against timber, steady and measured. And she let that sound be the one the cabin had been needing for such a very long time. It was the sound of something being built, not just mended, but truly and honestly built. She put an extra plate on the table without even thinking about it. And when she noticed what she had done, she did not take it away. The south fence post was done in a single morning, not the half-day he had figured on. Elias never said a word about it. He just started working on the inside frame of the north wall without being asked, and Clara made no mention of the change in plans. And that was just how things were between them now. It was a rhythm they had settled into without any big discussion. It was the kind of pace two people find when they are both paying close attention, without needing to spell everything out. The north wall took the full 2 days he had planned. Clara brought him water in the middle of the morning and then again in the middle of the afternoon. He drank it without stopping his work. She would stay just long enough to see how the repairs were coming along and then go back to her own chores. The third time she came out, she sat down on an overturned crate close to the wall and just watched for a bit, not making believe she was there for some other reason. And he did not make believe that he did not see her watching. "You want to hand me that brace?" he asked. She passed it right to him. "You are going to want to put a coat of paint on this part once it is finished," he said. "It will seal the wood, keep the damp from working its way back into the joint." "I know how to paint a wall," she said. "I know you do," he replied. She handed him the next board before he even had to ask for it. He took notice of that too. On the second evening, when the wall was finished and solid and all his tools were put away neat and clean, he came to the supper table and sat down. They ate just like they had been eating for weeks now. It was not the careful distance of their first few days. It was not two people acting like they were strangers. It was just them, there together. It was the way folks eat after they have been through something hard together. when that hard thing is over and the next part of the story has not yet started. Clara put down her fork. I got a letter from the records office today, she said. He looked up. The divorce papers have cleared the first step. Hartwell pushed it along for me. Gerald reckons he put it right at the top of the pile. She paused. 30 days can turn into 15 when a judge decides something needs deciding. 15 days, Elias said, give or take. And Jeb, she went on. Gerald heard from the sheriff's office in Pueblo. Jeb was handed the warrant 3 days ago. She stated it without any feeling, the way you say something too heavy for emotion. He took the choice to leave on his own 2 feet. He is out of the Colorado territory now. The sheriff will be on the lookout for a full 6 months. Elias let the silence hang for a minute. And how are you feeling about that? He finally asked. She gave it a good, honest thought, like she had been doing with everything these days. She did not offer a quick reply or a polite one, just the plain truth. I am relieved that he is gone. I am mad it took this long, and I know neither of those feelings gets to the heart of the matter. She reached for her fork again. I gave that man 11 years of my life. Most of those years were bad, but I walked into that marriage with my eyes open, and that is a weight I have to carry. You were only 23 when you married him, Elias pointed out. I was, she said back. That is not an age where a person has enough sense to keep themselves from making that kind of mistake. She looked straight at him. You say that like you have some experience with it. When I was 19, I hired on with a cattle crew that turned out to be running stolen horses, he explained. I had no idea for a good 2 months. The very day I found out, I quit, but that mistake still cost me. He paused for a bit. Being young and not knowing what you are getting into is not some kind of character flaw. It is just what it means to be young. She met his eyes. Is that what you say to make a person feel better? No, he replied. It is what I tell them because it is true. I do not say things just to make folks feel better. That kind of comfort tends to wear off pretty fast. She knew he was right about that. She had known it since around the 4th day, when he told her about that saloon in Trinidad without trying to make it sound any better than it was. It was another thing she had tucked away about him without thinking on it. The way you take note of things you can count on, things that can hold a heavy load, the kind of things you could build a life on. 15 days, she said one more time. 15 days, he said right back. She turned back to her supper. He did the same. Through the window, the summer night had settled in soft and dark, and the valley was peaceful in a way it had not been since Jeb's men rode out. This was a real quiet, not the kind of quiet where everyone is holding their breath. The stars were spread thick over the high mountains. Off on the north ridge, some animal made a sound just once before the world went still again. Clara placed her hands flat on the wooden kitchen table and finally spoke the words she had been struggling with for the last 3 days. I want you to stay. The sentence was simple and unadorned. There were no fancy words to dress it up, no easy way to back out of it. She figured if she was going to say it, she had to say the whole truth of it. Saying things halfway had never done her any good, and she was done with all that. Elias put his fork down with care. He did not give her an answer right away, and she let him have the quiet. She had come to learn that his silences meant he was taking the time to give a true answer, not just the first one that came to mind. Clara, he said, I think I know what you're about to say. She stopped him right there. You are going to tell me that trouble seems to find you. You are going to say that a man with your past is a heavy load for a woman who just settled her own troubles with the law. You are going to say something that sounds smart and unselfish, like you are doing it for my own good, but it is really just an old, sorry habit in a new set of clothes. He just watched her. Am I wrong? She asked. A moment of quiet passed between them. No, he said at last. Well, then I will say to you what I said to Jeb on that porch. She held his gaze steady. I am done letting fear make my choices for me. That means being afraid of what it might cost you to stay, which is your own burden to figure out, and being afraid of what it costs me to ask, which is mine to carry. So I am asking. What you do with that is up to you. The dinner table separated them, holding their 2 plates, 2 cups, and the oil lamp Clara had been lighting a little earlier each night, because she had grown to like its warm glow. I have slept in more places than I can rightly remember, Elias said, ever since I was 20 years old. I have made my bed in 30 different counties, and not one single time did I ever wake up feeling like I was in the place I was supposed to be. He stopped for a second. Until about day 9 of being here. Clara drew in a slow breath. Day 9, she repeated. That was the morning after I told you the story about Trinidad. I woke up in that lean-to, and the morning sun was cutting through the crack between the boards. I could hear you moving around in the kitchen, and I thought. He stopped, then tried again. I thought, this is it. And then I spent the next 7 days trying to convince myself I was wrong. And were you? Wrong? No, he said. I was not. She looked at him from her side of the table. Then stay. I will stay, he answered. It was not some big show, not a loud announcement. It was just a man agreeing to something that was already a fact, the way you accept a house foundation that has been fixed right. You do not celebrate it. You just stand on it and have faith it will hold you. She got up and took the plates to the wash basin. He brought his cup over and stood right next to her, and they washed the dishes together, the way they had started doing 4 days ago without ever talking about it. Side by side in the kitchen, the lamp throwing their tall shadows on the north wall, a wall that was now solid and whole and standing strong like it ought to be. Hannah's letter, Clara said as she passed him the second plate to dry. What about it? She said she was coming to visit. But she never said when. Letters take time to get to where they are headed, he said. She is a thoughtful kind of person. Clara nodded. She always was. She thinks about something clear to the end before she ever makes a move. She got that. She paused. She did not get that from Jeb. No, he said, his voice quiet. She is coming, Clara said. I am sure she is coming. I just do not know if that means in 3 weeks or in 3 months. Whenever she gets here, he said, that north wall will be strong and the roof will be sound, and there will be somebody here who knows when to give her room and when to stay near. Clara turned and looked directly at him. He dried the plate with the same focused care he gave to everything, complete and slow, as if that one single plate deserved to be dried perfectly. You think about her, Clara said. I think about what it must have cost her to write that letter back, he said. 5 years have gone by, and her mother sends a letter that does not even begin with an apology, and that girl reads it 4 times in 1 day. He set the plate on the shelf. That is a child who never quit wanting a home. She just had to be certain it was a safe place to return to. Clara stood without moving. I know a little something about that feeling, he said, not looking at her, his gaze still on the shelf. Wanting to be in a place but not being sure you are welcome. She placed the last cup on the shelf. You are welcome here, she said. He turned around. For a moment, they were just 2 people in a kitchen at the end of a long summer day. The lamp cast a warm light between them. The mountain was a huge dark shape outside the window, and the whole world around them felt mended and clean and solid. I'm going to go check on the barn, he said. I know, she replied. He went out. She stood there alone in her kitchen and let herself feel the true measure of what had just settled into place. It did not happen in a big dramatic fashion or with any kind of ceremony, but in the way that good things can sometimes arrive, quietly, with their full weight, landing right where they were always meant to be. She went to bed. She slept without the rifle. She had not even realized the first night she had done it, but she realized it now, and she lay there with that new knowledge for a while. The weight of it, or more truly, the absence of weight. The burden she had carried with her every single night for 3 years was just gone. It was like the final heavy rock had been taken out of a pack she had been carrying for so long, she had forgotten how heavy it was. She breathed out a long, slow breath. She slept. 14 days after that, Hannah arrived. Clara had no idea that it would be that morning. She learned about it the same way she learned about most important things. After it happened, by the impact it made. She was working in her garden when she heard a horse on the north path. Not the south path, but the north one, the long route. She stood up straight, her hands covered in dirt, and her heart beating a strange little rhythm in her chest that she would not call panic. Because it was not really panic. It was more like the feeling of a door you have been pushing against for a long, long time finally starting to swing open on its own. She heard Elias's voice from the yard. It was not loud or worried. It was the careful tone a man uses to introduce himself to a person who is not expecting an introduction but needs one. She heard his boots on the stone walkway. She heard him say, "She is in the garden. I will go let her know you are here." And then he was there at the garden gate, and his face had the look of a man who knew the exact importance of the next 60 seconds and was treating it with proper respect. She came up the north path, he said. She did not want to take the south way. She said she remembered the south path from when she was a girl, and it did not feel right to come back the same way she left. Clara's hands began to tremble again. "How does she look?" she asked. He took a second to consider. Worn out, wary, like someone who packed a bag to prepare for every possible outcome of this meeting. "Is she mad?" "I do not think so," he said. She asked if the roof was the same one as before, and I told her it was not, that it was plumb new. She just stared at it for a long while and finally said, "Good." Clara let out a slow breath. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay," he said back. "I will be over by the north wall." "There is not a thing wrong with the north wall." "I know," he said. "I will be over there all the same." She knew exactly what he was doing. He was giving her room. Not vanishing, not leaving her be, just putting himself somewhere close enough to count, but far enough away to let the next hour have the space it needed. She untied her gardening apron, wiped her hands clean on it, and hung it over the gatepost. She rounded the corner of the cabin and stepped into the yard. Hannah Whitlock was standing right there at the entrance to the stone path. She looked taller than Clara remembered her being. And then it hit Clara. That was not right. Hannah was the exact same height she had been at 16. The truth was, Clara had been holding on to the picture of a girl, and the woman standing by that gate was no girl anymore. She was 21 years old, with her daddy's stubborn jaw and her mother's eyes, and a way of setting her shoulders that was entirely her own. It was how a person stands when they have learned to carry heavy loads without buckling. And they have done it for so long it just looks like the natural way of things. Hannah's eyes were on the porch, taking in the support beam that stood straight now, the clean, solid line of the new roof, and the stone path that went from the gate to the steps, with not one stone out of place. Clara came to a stop at the other end of the path. They just looked at each other. 5 years. 5 whole years had passed in the quiet between them, feeling like a long season of drought, like 1,000 miles of bad road, like every wrong thing that was said and every right thing that was not. Hannah was the first to speak. "You fixed the path. The stones always shifted around in the spring rains." Clara answered, "Somebody reset them for me." "The whole thing?" "The whole thing." Hannah looked down at the pathway for a moment. Then her eyes came back up to meet Clara's. "Your letter said the roof made it through." "It did," Clara said, "through every single storm we had this summer." "The old roof never could," Hannah said. "No," Clara agreed. "It surely could not." A muscle jumped in Hannah's jaw. Something was stirring deep behind her eyes. It was not exactly anger, but a mighty close relative. The kind of feeling that lives right next door to anger and often gets mistaken for it, which is just plain grief. "I used to lie awake in my room and just listen to it," she said. The sound of the leak. I used to tell myself if I could just fix that one roof, everything else in this world would turn out different. I used to think the very same thing, Clara told her. You did? For years and years. Hannah glanced down at the stone path one more time. Then she looked her mother square in the eye. Is it different? Clara thought about the rifle she did not keep by the bed anymore. The knife she no longer wore on her hip. The extra plate set at the supper table that had been there for weeks without a word or a fuss. The north wall standing strong and sealed up tight. She thought about the signed papers tucked away in her dresser drawer with her name on them. Her name and hers alone. Her name as it was before and as it would be from now on. Yes, she said, it is. Hannah swallowed, and it looked like it took some effort. Mama, she said. It was just the one word. But the way she said it, with all 5 of those years packed inside it, all the leaving and the hurting and the not knowing the way back, it unlatched something in Clara's chest that had been cinched down hard since the morning Hannah rode east with her aunt and never once looked over her shoulder. Clara started walking up the stone path. Hannah started walking down it. They came together right there in the middle. It was not a graceful meeting, and neither one of them was being gentle. They were just 2 people closing a distance that had been too wide for too long and was now, at last, small enough to cross. They clung to each other right there in the center of the path. Neither one of them said, I am sorry. They did not need to. The solid path beneath their feet said it better than words ever could. Over by the north wall, the sound of a hammer went quiet. It did not stop because the job was finished. It stopped because a man who understood the importance of certain moments also understood that this one did not require an audience. Elias laid his hammer down and just let the valley be still for a little while. And in that quiet, 2 women stood on a stone path and held on to one another, and let 5 years of pain feel smaller than the 12 feet of ground it had once been. After a time, they went on inside. Clara put on a pot of coffee. Hannah sat down at the table, the very same one in the very same chair she used as a girl, and she just ran her hand across the old wood. She touched it the way you touch something precious you were sure you would never feel again. Who fixed the north wall? She asked. Elias, the man out in the yard. Yes, he introduced himself like he belongs here. Clara set 2 cups on the table. He does. Hannah looked straight at her, not with judgment, but with a sharp focus. The kind of keen attention a young woman pays when she is trying to piece together a story she does not have all the parts to. Was he the one who fixed all this, or most of it? Did he? Hannah began, then stopped and found different words. Is he good to you? That single question carried 21 years of hard living, 5 years of silence, and every lonesome night Clara had spent in that house after Jeb was gone. Hannah held her mother's gaze for a long time, reading her the way only a daughter can, looking past the words for the truth she knew she would find in her eyes. She must have seen what she was looking for. Okay, she said, nodding her head slow. Okay, then. Hannah wrapped both her hands around the warm coffee cup. I want to hear the whole story, from the very beginning. And so Clara told her. She told her about the knock that came right at high noon, about the man who knelt in the dirt rather than step onto her porch uninvited. She explained about the deed, the terrible debt to the Halversons, and the 2 long years she went on without ever knowing she was free. She told her about Tom Aldis standing on her porch, about Cole Ransom hiding at the edge of the trees, about climbing out her back window in the dead of night and finding Elias on the west track. She told the story just the way that summer had unfolded, racing by in some parts and dragging its feet in others. The full weight of it all settled right where it needed to. Hannah listened without saying a word, just like she always had, taking it all in, sorting it through, and letting it settle before she spoke. When Clara was finally done, Hannah sat in the quiet for a good long while. Then she said, You climbed out the back window. I sure did, with a rifle in my hand, in the dark. Clara nodded. It was either that or let them burn the house down with me in it. A new kind of understanding washed over Hannah's face. "You were not like that before," she said softly. "No," Clara said, "I was not." "What changed?" Clara thought on it for a second. "I got mad instead of scared," she said, "and I stopped being by my lonesome." Hannah slowly turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I thought about coming home," she said, "more times than I can count. I just never knew what I would be coming home to." "I know. I was scared you would find it was all just the same. The leaking and the waiting and the way the house felt." Her voice trailed off. "Like it was always just about to fall in on us." "It was," Clara said, "but it is not anymore." Hannah looked up at the ceiling, then at the wall, and over at the window that no longer had a smoke stain above it. "No," she said, "it surely is not." They sat with that good feeling for a minute. Outside, the sound of a hammer started up again, steady and even. It was the sound of work that just keeps on, because there is always something that needs doing, and doing it right is what matters. Hannah cocked her head toward the sound. "What is he working on now?" "There's not a thing wrong with anything," Clara said. "He just works. He finds things that need doing." "That is a good thing in a man," Hannah said. "It is," Clara agreed. They drank their coffee. After a bit, Hannah got up, walked over to the door, and opened it. She looked out at the yard, the stone path, and the man working on the north wall with the kind of deep concentration a person has when they treat every single job like it is the most important one in the world. "Mr. Mercer," she called out. Elias turned around. "Coffee is ready," Hannah said with a little smile. "You want a cup?" His eyes met hers, then glanced over to Clara, who was leaning against the kitchen doorframe, just taking it all in. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "Thank you." He came up on the porch. He stopped right at the door, just as he had on that first day, waiting for an invitation, not about to cross the threshold on his own. But this time was different. Hannah stepped aside and held the screen door wide open for him. And this time he was not just stepping into a stranger's house. He was coming home. He sat down at the table, and Hannah poured him a cup before she sat back down in her own chair. Clara stayed by the counter. For a long moment, not one of them said a word. The kitchen just held the three of them in the warm summer light coming through the clean window. The north wall was solid, the roof was sound, and everything underneath it felt just the way it was supposed to. Then Hannah looked at Elias and said, "Mama tells me you looked up her deed." "I did," he answered. He did it before she even realized she needed to ask him, before she knew there was anything that needed asking for in the first place. Hannah looked at him with her mother's eyes, but with a way of sizing him up that was all her own. "Why?" she asked. "Because it needed doing," he said, plain and simple. "And I was here." That is the whole story. Hannah studied him for another moment. Then she looked over at her mother. A complete conversation went between them in that single look, that quiet language that mothers and daughters have when they know what is in each other's hearts. Clara gave just a small nod. Hannah turned back to Elias. "Can you teach me how to reset a fence post?" she asked. "The one on the east side of the paddock has been leaning since I was 12 years old, and nobody ever did get around to fixing it." The corner of Elias's mouth pulled into a little smile. "After coffee," he said. "After coffee," she agreed. Clara turned back to the counter. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her heart was full of something that was not quite happiness, because happiness had always felt like something that comes and goes. And this was not something that comes and goes. This was solid, something that could hold a heavy weight, the kind of thing that lasts through summer storms and winter freezes, and just the simple passing of the years. It was the feeling of a foundation that had been put to the test and had held up and would hold up again. She thought of a man kneeling in the dust of her yard on that very first day, holding his hat in both hands, saying, "I have not been welcome anywhere in 3 years." She thought about Hannah at the gate, looking down at the stone path. She thought about the 15 long days of hard work that led to a single signature on a piece of paper. That paper meant this place was finally truly hers. She remembered what Elias had told her at the supper table. He said, "I have laid my head down in 30 different counties, and not one time did I wake up feeling like I was where I was meant to be. Until about day 9 right here." She pictured the 3rd chair she had quietly set at the table weeks ago, and thought about the 4th one that would be needed now. Neither one of those chairs needed a big announcement or a long story. They just needed doing, the same way everything that truly mattered in life needed doing. You do it steady, without a lot of fuss, one day at a time. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the doorway. Out on the stone path, Hannah was already full of questions, and Elias was giving her answers. He was walking with her toward the paddock, explaining how the soil works and how deep a post ought to be set. He told her how the frost in the winter can push the earth right up if you do not anchor the posts just right. Hannah was nodding along, listening with the kind of focus of a person who planned on remembering and using every single word she heard. Clara stood there in the doorway of her own cabin. It was her cabin, her deed, her daughter, and her man. He was walking on that stone path holding his hat in his hand, the same way he always did when he was not working. He treated every patch of ground he stepped on with a kind and careful respect. The summer valley stretched out all around their property with the ridge, the tall grass, and the mountains standing dark along the edge of the world. High above them, the late August sky was a blue so deep it was hard to believe. The kind of blue you only ever see way up in the high country. It was the kind of blue that made you feel small, but also made you know exactly where you stood in the world. It was a good kind of small. It meant you were a piece of something much larger than yourself, but you were rooted deep in the part of it that was all yours. The roof above them held strong. The path beneath their feet was solid, and the woman in the doorway of the house she had poured her life into had finally come all the way home. It was the place she had been heading toward for 11 years, then 3 more, and 14 days. And it all started with one knock at her door in the high noon sun. This was more than safety, more than owning something, more than a life without fear. This was home, the genuine kind, the kind with a roof that does not leak, the kind you earn by staying when it would have been a whole lot easier to leave. You get it by mending what is broken instead of just walking away from the mess. You get it by letting the right people in and trusting them to step gently into your life. Clara May Whitlock stood in her doorway and watched her daughter learn how to set a fence post. The teacher was a man who had kneeled in her own dirt just 3 weeks ago, needing a place to feel finally and truly and completely welcomed. And she knew that this moment was what the entire summer had been building toward. It was not about the fixed roof or the clean deed, or even the signed papers with only her name on them. It was this, right here. 3 people on a stone path on a late morning in August with the mountains watching over them, the work carrying on and the foundation holding firm. A house becomes a home on the day that someone strong enough to leave proves they are even stronger by choosing to stay. And on this morning, in this valley, in the high summer country of the Colorado Territory in the year 1876, everyone who mattered had stayed. That was enough. That was everything. That was home.